Please, pretend you're my dad. The girl grabbed a millionaire's hand, and forced him to face a threat from her past. The shopping street was loud with late afternoon noise, filled with people moving in different directions, their conversations blending into a constant hum. Music spilled out of open cafe doors, cars slowed at the crosswalk, and somewhere a street performer was playing a familiar tune badly out of tune. It was the kind of place where everyone was busy enough not to notice anyone else. Michael Hayes noticed her because she stopped. He had just stepped out of a jewelry store, his phone pressed to his ear, already halfway through a conversation he no longer cared about, when he felt a sudden tug on his hand. Not a bump, not an accident, but a deliberate grip, small fingers wrapping tightly around his palm as if letting go was not an option. He looked down, startled. A little girl stood beside him, no older than 7. She had pale blonde hair pulled back carelessly, wisps escaping around her face, and wide blue eyes that were fixed on his with a kind of urgency that instantly cut through the noise around them. She wore a light pink dress that looked too thin for the cool weather, and her other hand trembled slightly at her side. "Please," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the crowd. "Please, pretend you're my dad." The words hit him harder than any demand for money ever had. Michael blinked, certain for a moment that he had misheard her. He had been asked for favors, for signatures, for investments, for donations. He had never been asked for this. Before he could respond, her grip tightened, nails pressing into his skin, and he felt how fast she was shaking. He followed her gaze. Across the street, near the edge of the crowd, stood a man who did not belong. He wasn't moving with the flow of people, wasn't checking his phone or talking to anyone. He stood still, watching them, his posture relaxed in a way that felt practiced. His eyes were locked on the girl, and when he noticed Michael looking back, a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. Michael's first instinct was disbelief. His second was calculation. The man didn't look dangerous in an obvious way. No raised voice, no aggressive movement. Just presence. The kind that unsettles you only after you realize you've already noticed it. The girl leaned closer to Michael, pressing against his side as if trying to disappear into him. "Don't look at him too long," she whispered. "He gets angry when people notice." Michael felt something cold settle in his chest. He lowered his phone and ended the call without thinking. Then, very deliberately, he shifted his stance, placing himself slightly in front of the girl. He rested a protective hand over hers, not pulling away, not questioning her, just acknowledging the role she had asked him to play. "Hey," he said, raising his voice just enough to sound natural. "Sorry I'm late, sweetheart. Did you wait long?" The girl looked up at him, startled, then nodded quickly, playing along with desperate precision. "A little," she said. "I stayed where you told me." The man across the street took a step closer. Michael smiled, the polite, effortless smile he used in boardrooms and negotiations, the one that revealed nothing. Inside, his thoughts were racing. Who was this child? Why him? And why did she look like someone who had learned, far too young, how to survive by choosing strangers carefully? He leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to hers, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emily," she whispered back. "Please don't let go." "I won't," Michael said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. As the man's shadow stretched closer across the pavement, Michael understood something instinctively and with unsettling clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not imagination. And whatever Emily was running from, she had chosen him as her last, fragile shield in a world that had not protected her yet. He straightened, tightened his grip just enough to be reassuring, and prepared to do something he had never planned on doing that day. Stay. Michael did not move right away. He kept his posture relaxed, casual enough not to draw attention, yet every sense in him was focused and alert. Emily's small hand was still locked around his, her fingers cold and tense, as if she were afraid the ground might disappear beneath her feet the moment he stepped away. He could feel her pulse through her palm, fast and uneven. The man across the street slowed his steps, clearly reassessing the situation. His smile faded, replaced by something harder, more irritated. He looked Michael up and down, taking in the tailored coat, the confident stance, the way Emily stood pressed close to him. For a brief moment, Michael wondered whether the man would turn away, whether this small act of pretending would be enough. It wasn't. The man crossed the street deliberately, stopping a few feet away. Up close, he smelled faintly of cheap cologne and cigarettes. His eyes flicked down to Emily, then back up to Michael, as if weighing his options. "You her father?" he asked, his voice low and rough, meant to sound casual. Michael didn't answer immediately. He tightened his hold on Emily's hand and drew her half a step closer, resting his other hand lightly on her shoulder. The gesture was instinctive, protective, and it came more naturally than he expected. "Yes," he said evenly. "Is there a problem?" The man let out a short laugh. "Funny," he said. "Didn't think she had one." Emily flinched at the sound. Michael felt it instantly. "You must be mistaken," Michael replied, his tone calm but firm. "We're in a hurry." He turned slightly, angling his body so that Emily was shielded behind him, and began to walk. The movement was slow, unhurried, as if he had nothing to fear. Inside, however, his heart was pounding. He was acutely aware of how public this street was, how many eyes were nearby, and yet how isolated moments like this could still feel. The man followed. Emily's grip tightened again, and she leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "He's my uncle," she whispered. "My dad's brother." Michael didn't look back. "Does your mom know he's here?" he asked quietly. Emily shook her head. "He says she owes him money. He says my dad owed him before he died. He comes to our building sometimes. He yells." Michael felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. He slowed near the entrance of a busy cafe, stopping beneath its bright awning where people sat at small tables, laughing, drinking coffee, completely unaware of the tension unfolding a few steps away. He turned to face the man again. "Whatever you think you're owed," Michael said, keeping his voice level, "it has nothing to do with her. You need to leave." The man's eyes narrowed. "This is family business," he snapped. "You should mind your own." Michael met his gaze without flinching. "I am." For a moment, it felt as if the street had gone quiet, the noise receding into the background. Then a waiter stepped out of the cafe, glancing between them with mild curiosity, and a couple walking past slowed just enough to notice the confrontation. The man cursed under his breath. He looked at Emily one last time, his expression sharp and resentful, then took a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered, before turning and disappearing into the crowd. Emily didn't relax immediately. She stood frozen, staring at the place where he had vanished, her breathing shallow and uneven. Michael crouched down in front of her, bringing himself to her level. "He's gone," he said gently. "You're safe right now." Her eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for far too long, and she nodded, though her body was still trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "He listens when grown-ups are scared of him. I needed someone he wouldn't scare." Michael straightened slowly, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. He realized that pretending had stopped being an act the moment he chose not to walk away. Whatever came next, this was no longer about playing a role. It was about protecting a child who had already learned what it meant to be afraid, and had still found the courage to ask for help. They stayed where they were for several minutes, long enough for the tension to drain from the air and for the ordinary rhythm of the street to reclaim the space the man had occupied. Emily did not move away from Michael. Even after the crowd swallowed her uncle completely, she kept her fingers wrapped around his hand, as if releasing it might undo everything that had just happened. Michael guided her to a small table just inside the cafe, choosing a spot near the window where the light was warm and the sounds of conversation created a comforting blur. He ordered a hot chocolate for her without asking, trusting instinct more than logic at this point, and a coffee for himself that he barely touched. When the cup was placed in front of Emily, she stared at it for a moment before bringing her hands close, letting the warmth soak into her skin. "You can let go," Michael said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily loosened her grip slowly, cautiously, as though testing whether the promise would hold. Her shoulders sagged once her hand was free, exhaustion finally breaking through the fear that had kept her upright. "I didn't know who else to ask," she said after a while. Her voice was quiet but steadier now. "He scares my mom. And when he scares her, she can't think." Michael listened without interrupting, watching the way Emily spoke as if she had practiced these sentences many times in her head but never believed she would be allowed to say them out loud. "He started coming after my dad died," she continued. "At first he said it was just paperwork. Then he said it was money. A lot of money. Mom told him we didn't have it, but he said that didn't matter." Michael felt his jaw tighten. "And he started threatening her." Emily nodded. "He said if she didn't pay, he'd make things difficult. He said I was part of the problem because Dad left debts behind." She wrapped her hands around the mug, staring down into the steam. "I don't think my dad owed him anything. But he says things until you start to doubt yourself." The word struck Michael harder than he expected. He had dealt with powerful, manipulative people his entire life, men who used pressure and fear as tools. Hearing that same strategy applied to a child made something in him shift, sharp and unyielding. "Where is your mom now?" he asked. "At work," Emily replied. "She works late. I walk home alone from school most days." He knows that. Michael exhaled slowly, keeping his voice even. "Did he ever hurt you?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "Not yet. But he gets close. He talks very softly when no one is around. He tells me I should remind my mom what happens when people don't pay their debts." Michael felt a cold, steady anger settle into place. This wasn't just intimidation. It was calculated. "Emily," he said carefully, "what you did today was very smart. You didn't run. You didn't hide. You found a place with people and light, and you asked for help." She looked up at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. He said no one would believe me. Michael met her gaze without hesitation. "I believe you." Something in her expression cracked then. Not tears, but relief so deep it left her momentarily speechless. She nodded, once, firmly, as if sealing that truth in her mind. "I don't need you to pretend anymore," she said after a moment. "He won't come back today." Michael leaned back slightly, studying her, realizing how much strength it had taken for her to say that. "I wasn't pretending," he said quietly. "Not really." Emily frowned, confused. "I don't know what this makes me yet," Michael continued. "But I do know this. You and your mom shouldn't be dealing with this alone. And you won't." She watched him carefully, weighing his words the way she had learned to do with adults. Then, very slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "But can you walk me home? Just today. Michael didn't hesitate. Of course. As they left the cafe together, stepping back into the flow of the street, Michael understood that something irreversible had already happened. The role Emily had asked him to play had opened a door he could no longer close. And for the first time in a long while, the idea of stepping into the unknown did not feel like a risk. It felt like a responsibility. They walked slowly, choosing streets that were brighter and more crowded, even though the evening was beginning to thin the number of people outside. Michael adjusted his pace to Emily's, noticing how she kept half a step behind him, her eyes constantly scanning reflections in windows and parked cars. Every few minutes she glanced up at him, as if confirming that he was still paying attention, that this wasn't another moment where an adult's concern faded once the danger seemed distant. "Does he know where you live?" Michael asked quietly as they crossed an intersection. Emily nodded. "He's been there," she said. "He never comes inside. He just stands across the street or waits near the corner. Mom pretends she doesn't see him." Michael felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the same one he felt during hostile negotiations, when silence was used as a weapon. Only this time, the imbalance of power was unforgivable. "That's not something she should have to pretend about," he said. Emily didn't answer. She stopped suddenly, her hand tightening around the strap of her backpack. Michael followed her gaze to the other side of the street, where a man stood beneath a broken streetlight. It wasn't her uncle, but Emily's body reacted before her mind could catch up, shoulders rising, breath shortening. "It's not him," Michael said gently, placing himself slightly in front of her again. "Look at his shoes. Different jacket too." She studied the man for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. "I hate that my body does that," she said. "Even when it's not him." Michael understood more than he wanted to. "That doesn't mean you're weak," he replied. "It means you've been paying attention for a long time." When they reached her building, Emily stopped at the entrance. It was an older apartment block with dim lighting and a narrow hallway that swallowed sound. She hesitated, staring inside as if crossing that threshold meant losing the safety she'd borrowed for the afternoon. "Can you come up?" she asked softly. "Just so he sees." Michael didn't question it. He followed her inside, noting the security cameras that hadn't been updated in years and the broken lock that someone had tried to fix with tape. The elevator creaked as it rose, and Emily stood rigid beside him, her fingers brushing his sleeve without quite touching. Her apartment was small but tidy, the kind of place kept carefully in order because chaos was not an option. Her mother's coat hung by the door, and a pair of worn shoes sat neatly beneath it. Emily moved automatically, setting her backpack down, then freezing as if unsure what to do next. "She'll be home soon," she said. "She always worries if I'm late." Michael nodded. "We should call her," he said. "Together." Emily hesitated, then agreed. When her mother answered, her voice tight with concern, Emily spoke quickly, explaining only that she was home and safe and that someone had walked with her. She didn't mention her uncle. Not yet. After the call ended, Emily sat on the edge of the couch, suddenly looking much smaller than she had on the street. "He'll come back," she said quietly. "He always does when he thinks he's losing." Michael crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes. "Then we won't let him think that," he said. "I'm not disappearing after today." She studied his face carefully, the way she had since the moment she grabbed his hand. "Adults say that a lot," she said. "But they usually mean, for now." Michael didn't rush his answer. "I mean longer than that," he said. "I don't know exactly how yet, but I'll figure it out." Emily leaned back against the couch, processing this. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping briefly across the living room wall. She flinched, then steadied herself. "You don't have to be my dad for real," she said after a long pause. "Just, don't let him scare my mom anymore." Michael felt the weight of her request settle into him, heavier than any contract he had ever signed. He understood then that what she was asking for wasn't protection just for herself, but for the only adult she trusted. "I won't," he said simply. As they waited for her mother to return, sitting in the quiet apartment filled with the hum of distant traffic, Michael realized that the line between pretending and becoming had already blurred. And for the first time, he didn't feel the urge to step back. Emily's mother arrived home just after sunset, her footsteps quick and uneven in the hallway before the door opened. She froze when she saw Michael standing in the living room, her expression shifting instantly from confusion to alarm. Years of tension showed in the way her shoulders tightened, in how her eyes went first to Emily and only then to the stranger beside her. "Emily," she said, her voice low and careful. "Who is this?" Emily stood up from the couch, suddenly small again, her earlier courage dimmed by the fear of what this conversation might bring. "Mom, please don't be mad," she said quickly. "He walked me home. I asked him to pretend." The word pretend landed heavily in the room. Michael stepped forward before the silence could harden into suspicion. "My name is Michael Hayes," he said calmly. "Your daughter stopped me on the street today because she was frightened. Someone was following her." The woman's face drained of color. She closed the door behind her with shaking hands and leaned against it for support. "Robert," she said quietly, not as a question. Emily nodded. Her mother closed her eyes, a breath shuddering out of her as if something she had been holding back for years had finally broken through. "I tried to keep him away from you," she whispered. "I thought if I didn't react, if I didn't fight back, he'd get bored." Michael felt a familiar anger rise, but he kept his voice steady. "That's not how people like him work," he said. "Silence looks like permission to them." Emily's mother looked at him sharply, guilt and exhaustion warring in her eyes. "You think I don't know that?" she asked. "My husband died with debts everyone swore were real, but no one could prove. Robert used that. He said if I didn't pay, he'd ruin us. He said he'd take Emily." Emily flinched at the words, and Michael saw the exact moment when the fear she had carried alone was finally spoken out loud. He moved closer to her without thinking, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "He followed her today," Michael said. "Close enough that she was terrified. She did exactly the right thing." Her mother looked down at Emily, tears finally spilling free. "Why didn't you tell me it was that bad?" she asked. Emily swallowed. "You were already scared," she said softly. "I didn't want to make it worse." The room fell silent again, heavier this time, filled with the weight of what both of them had been protecting each other from. Michael realized then how carefully fear had been passed back and forth between them, growing stronger in the quiet. "This can't continue," Michael said finally. "Not like this." Emily's mother straightened, wiping her face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you don't have to handle him alone anymore," Michael replied. "Threats, extortion, harassment, none of that is legal. And none of it should be happening to a child." She let out a bitter laugh. "You think I haven't tried? Lawyers cost money. Police want proof. He's careful." Michael met her gaze. "So am I." The confidence in his voice startled even him. He wasn't offering charity or empty reassurance. He was offering action. He explained slowly, carefully, what could be done: documentation, restraining orders, recorded threats, legal pressure that didn't rely on fear staying quiet. He didn't promise miracles. He promised persistence. Emily watched him closely, her blue eyes moving between him and her mother, searching for cracks. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "You said you weren't pretending anymore," she reminded him. Michael looked at her and nodded. "I meant it." Her mother studied him for a long moment, then sighed, the sound of someone finally setting down a burden too heavy to carry alone. "If you help us," she said quietly, "you're stepping into something ugly." Michael didn't look away. "I know." Emily reached for his hand again, not with the desperate grip from earlier, but with something gentler, more certain. In that small apartment, as night settled in around them, Michael understood that the danger had not ended when the man disappeared from the street. It had only shifted shape. And this time, he wasn't walking away. The next weeks unfolded with a tension that never fully left the room, even when everything appeared calm on the surface. Michael moved with deliberate focus, the kind that came from years of navigating hostile negotiations, only now the stakes were far more personal. He began by listening, really listening, as Emily's mother, Sarah, laid out everything she had endured since her husband's death. Dates, words, places, moments she had tried to forget because remembering them hurt too much. Michael wrote nothing down at first. He let her speak until the story came out whole, uninterrupted, no longer fractured by fear or apology. When he finally began to act, it was methodical. He connected Sarah with a legal team that specialized in coercion and financial extortion, people who understood how threats hid behind family ties and unprovable debts. He insisted on documenting everything, even the moments that felt insignificant. Every call that ended abruptly. Every message left unanswered but understood. Every time Robert appeared where he wasn't supposed to be. Emily watched these preparations from the edges of the room, quiet but alert. She noticed how Michael never raised his voice, never rushed, never dismissed a detail as too small. When he spoke to lawyers on the phone, his tone was calm, almost gentle, yet unyielding. It was the first time she had seen an adult confront the danger without fear or denial. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table while Sarah spoke privately with an attorney in the next room, Emily leaned toward Michael. "He doesn't like it when people don't get scared," she said softly. Michael nodded. "People like that depend on fear," he replied. "When it stops working, they lose control." Emily considered this carefully. Will he come back when he knows? He might try, Michael answered honestly. But he won't get what he wants. That honesty mattered more than reassurance. Emily had learned too early that false comfort broke trust faster than silence. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Robert appeared outside the apartment building one afternoon, standing across the street as he always had, his presence unmistakable even from a distance. This time, Michael was there. He did not step outside immediately. He waited, watched, and called the authorities, already prepared with documentation and recorded threats. When Robert noticed Michael watching from the window, his expression shifted from confidence to irritation. He crossed the street, anger sharpening his movements, but stopped short when he saw a police car turn the corner. For the first time, he did not smile. Emily stood beside Michael, her hands trembling slightly but her posture steady. "He looks smaller," she said quietly. Michael glanced down at her. That's what happens when people can't hide behind silence anymore. The restraining order came days later. Formal. Unambiguous. Enforced. Robert's reaction was explosive, but contained, redirected into legal channels where intimidation lost its power. Emily did not celebrate. She simply slept through the night for the first time in months. In the quiet that followed, something else began to take shape. Emily no longer asked Michael if he would leave. She assumed his presence the way children do when something becomes reliable. She waited for him at the window when he said he would arrive. She set an extra place at the table without asking. These were not grand gestures, but they carried weight. One evening, as Michael prepared to leave, Emily stopped him at the door. "You don't have to come every day," she said, studying his face. "But I like when you do." Michael felt the words settle deep inside him. "I like it too," he replied. As he walked away that night, the city lights reflecting in the pavement, Michael understood that the battle they were fighting was no longer just against one man. It was against the idea that fear gets to decide who stays and who leaves. And for the first time, fear was losing. Life did not suddenly become easy after that, but it became steadier, and that difference mattered more than any dramatic victory. The days settled into a new rhythm, one that felt unfamiliar at first yet slowly began to hold. Emily returned to school without constantly looking over her shoulder, though she still noticed who stood too close and who lingered too long. The fear had not vanished, but it no longer controlled her movements. It had become something quieter, something she carried without letting it decide for her. Michael remained a constant presence, though he was careful not to force himself into their lives too quickly. He showed up when he said he would, and when work pulled him away, he explained where he was going and when he would be back. Emily listened closely to those explanations, not because she needed details, but because consistency mattered. Each promise kept stitched another small piece of trust into place. Sarah watched the change with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She had spent so long bracing herself for collapse that stability felt almost suspicious. One evening, after Emily had gone to her room to finish homework, Sarah sat across from Michael at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between them. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You stepped into something you didn't create." Michael shook his head. "I stepped into something I saw," he replied. "That's different." She studied him for a moment. "Emily talks about you at school," she admitted. "She tells her teacher you're the one who makes her feel safe." The word struck Michael harder than any compliment ever had. He looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of how much responsibility came with being seen that way. "I don't want to replace anyone," he said carefully. Sarah nodded. "I know. And I wouldn't ask that. But she lost her father, and what she remembers most is how alone we were after. You changed that." Emily changed too in ways that were small but unmistakable. She laughed more easily, argued about bedtime, complained about vegetables. These ordinary frustrations felt like victories. One afternoon, she surprised Michael by taking his hand without fear or urgency, simply because she wanted to. "Do you know what I like best?" she asked as they walked together through the park. "What?" Michael replied. "You don't get loud when things go wrong," she said. "My uncle always did. Even when nothing happened yet." Michael felt a familiar tightening in his chest. "Getting loud makes some people feel powerful," he said. "But it doesn't fix anything." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I think my dad was quiet too." They stopped near a bench, and Emily climbed onto it, swinging her legs. "If he were here," she said after a long pause, "I think he would like you." Michael didn't answer right away. The weight of the moment demanded honesty without intrusion. "I'd like to think so," he said finally. That evening, as Michael prepared to leave, Emily followed him to the door. She hesitated, then spoke with careful seriousness. "You don't have to pretend anymore," she said. "Everyone knows now." Michael knelt slightly so they were closer to eye level. "I wasn't pretending," he said softly. "I was learning." Emily smiled, small and certain. She stepped forward and hugged him, not tightly, not desperately, but with the ease of someone who knew the embrace would be returned. Michael wrapped his arms around her, understanding in that moment that whatever this connection was becoming, it had already rooted itself deep. As he walked away into the evening, the city no longer felt like a place filled with threats waiting to surface. It felt like a place where something fragile had been protected long enough to grow stronger. And for the first time since that afternoon on the crowded street, Michael allowed himself to believe that the story unfolding between them was no longer about fear. It was about staying. The change did not announce itself with a single moment or a dramatic decision. It arrived quietly, woven into ordinary days that no longer felt fragile. Emily began planning ahead again, talking about school projects weeks in advance, about birthdays that were still far away, about things that required believing in a future that would actually arrive. Fear no longer stood between her and tomorrow. Michael found that his own life had shifted just as deeply. Work still demanded his attention, but it no longer consumed him. He left meetings early without guilt, turned down opportunities that would pull him too far away, and stopped measuring his worth by how full his schedule looked. What mattered now happened in the spaces between obligations, in evenings spent at a small kitchen table, in walks that had no destination beyond being together. The legal process concluded with a finality that felt both relieving and sobering. Robert was no longer allowed near Sarah or Emily, his threats rendered powerless by distance and consequence. Emily listened quietly as the outcome was explained to her, nodding once, then asking a question that surprised everyone. "So it's really over?" she asked. "Yes," Sarah said softly. "It's over." Emily considered this, then exhaled, a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. That night, she slept without waking, her dreams unbroken by fear. Weeks later, on a warm afternoon, the three of them sat in the park watching children run past in chaotic circles of laughter and noise. Emily lay on the grass between Michael and her mother, tracing shapes in the air with her fingers. "Do you remember the first day we met?" she asked suddenly. Michael smiled. "I don't think I could forget it." "I thought you would pull your hand away," she said matter-of-factly. "Most people do when they don't understand why you're scared." Michael looked down at her. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "But I'm glad I didn't." Emily rolled onto her side and rested her head against his arm, not seeking protection, just closeness. "I'm glad too," she said. Sarah watched them quietly, emotion flickering across her face. "You didn't just help us," she said to Michael later, when Emily had wandered off to play. "You gave her something she lost when her father died. The feeling that someone would stay." Michael shook his head slowly. "She gave that to me too," he replied. "She reminded me what staying actually means." As the sun began to set, Emily ran back toward them, cheeks flushed, hair messy, smiling freely. She took Michael's hand without thinking, the gesture so natural it no longer carried memory of fear. "Can we get ice cream?" she asked. Michael laughed. "Of course." They walked away together, not as a rescue story frozen in time, but as something living and ongoing. The street was busy, full of strangers, yet Emily walked without looking over her shoulder. She didn't need to ask anyone to pretend anymore. Because sometimes the people who change your life are not the ones you planned for, and sometimes family begins not with blood or promises, but with one brave moment when a child chooses to trust, and an adult chooses not to let go.